think we'll start. I'm Shel Marinkovich, Assistant Vice Provost and Director of the Center for Teaching and Learning, and thank you so much for coming to the second in our series this quarter of award-winning teachers on teaching. We're very honored to have the Albert Bourard Professor of Literature, Hans-Ulrich Gumbrecht, to talk to us about In Praise of Real Classroom Presence. And I'm just so happy that he's willing to tackle the topic of the virtues of in-person teaching, given the fact that it's been so fashionable to talk about technology-mediated instruction. Now, I have to say, I've been doing introductions in this series for 7 years now, and I'm really pleased that the series has been going on that long. But in that period of time, as you can imagine, I've been able to see some pretty amazing CVs because we've had so many distinguished members of the Stanford faculty talk. But I must say Professor Gumbrecht's CV is really unique in the breadth of his scholarly background, in the breadth of his scholarly scope, and in the breadth of his interests and his publications. This is a man with a voracious intellectual appetite and the ability to communicate about those ideas and also to pique the curiosity of others. He received his PhD in 1971 from the University of Konstanz after having studied Romance philology, German literature, sociology, and philosophy, and here I will have to definitely check my notes because you'll begin to get an idea of what I mean by the scope of his background. After studies in Munich, Regensburg, Salamanca, Pavia, and of course Konstanz. And besides Stanford, where he is on the faculty in the departments of comparative literature, French and Italian, Spanish and Portuguese, and the program in modern thought and literature. He has been on the faculty at the University of Bochum and at Siegen. And he has held visiting professorships literally all over the world. And in addition to his appointments at Stanford, he is also Professeur Associé at the University of Montreal, and he is the Directeur d'études associées at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris. Now, he's a specialist in the histories of French, Spanish, and Italian literature in the medieval period, the 18th century, the fin de siècle, and the early 19th century. He's also the author of almost 500 publications. I'm on number 499.
We have crossed this threshold.
But he writes not only highly scholarly works, such as his 1994 Materialities of Communication and his 1996 Cultural Authority in the Spanish Age, but in his devotion to reaching a wider audience, he's also a regular contributor to the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung and to other leading newspapers, including those in Brazil. Now, as if that wasn't enough to make him stand out.
What has he done lately?
I'm going to tell you.
What brought him into our series was the fact that he is an award-winning teacher, having received in 1995 the H&S Dean's Award for Distinguished Teaching. And rather interestingly, in year 2000, he won the Cuthbertson Award for his organization of the Presidential Lectures and Symposia in the Humanities and the Arts. But although the Cuthbertson is normally given for service to Stanford, in his case, there was an emphasis on the fact that not only had he organized these lectures, but he had turned them into an incredible learning opportunity for the entire Stanford campus. So I'm happy to turn things over to him, but I also have to say that the next time someone expresses skepticism about the possibility of combining teaching and research at the highest levels, I will have on the tip of my tongue the name of Professor Hans-Ulrich Gumbrecht.
Thank you. So now I'm going to speak. You asked me. It's okay. First of all, thank you for this introduction. I don't know whether I should say thank you because it's embarrassing. you know, the fact that it is so long does not necessarily attest to the breadth and depth of my scholarship. That, in the first place, that probably attests to my narcissism, right? I mean, people who really love their CV and their list of publications, and there's one person here in the room who knows how much I love my list of publications. But I also wanted to thank you for this unusual introduction, because it is the first time that anybody has introduced me here at Stanford that all the German names and words have been pronounced correctly. Congratulations. I mean, even my own children cannot pronounce Gumbrecht correctly, so they say Gumbrecht or something like that, or Gumbrecht. Anyway, so thanks for the invitation to speak in this context. I'm all the more thankful, and this is already going to be my first part, as I told you by email on the phone, I'm not, and honestly not quite convinced that I'm such a good teacher. And that's going to be my first point, that I'm a bad teacher, that you already have a symptom for that, because some people here know that I am what a German colleague once called a decimal fetishist. I have this habit that I like to say, I have so and so many points. So actually this presentation today has 6 main points. That's the line of the argument. And the first point, in which I'm going to tell you why I think I'm not a good teacher, has 7 points. So it's unfortunately unsymmetrical. I had written it has 6, but then when I checked my notes this morning, I found out it has 7 points. I mean, the whole thing is going to last 35, 40 minutes. There's another thing about teaching. Some people have heard me saying that. If it's too long or if it's too short, it will always depend on you. It will be your fault, because if you look like you're very, very bored, then I'm going to go faster because I'm going to be embarrassed. And if you're kind enough to pretend that you're very interested, then it's going to be very long. So, but it will be something between 35 and 40 minutes, I guess. So the first reason why I don't think that I deserve to speak in this series is that the only teaching award, real teaching award, Cuthbertson is something different, as Michelle said, that I've ever won in my life was at Stanford. But that is a teaching award, the H&S Dean's Teaching Award, that everybody, even the pedagogically challenged, get at some point. I mean, if you're only long enough at Stanford, there will be a year when you get this award. I've been at the committee at some point, and I thought if these were the standards by which I passed, I don't really feel terribly honored. I was tempted to remove the kind of document from my wall of triumph, as my children call it, at home. The second point is that I usually do get okay evaluations, like everybody in the complete department. I think just in sync with that department, which is good in teaching, something like in this new categories like 4.5 plus, but, and that's the second point why I don't think I'm all that good a teacher, every other year, every 3 years, I don't really know, I get a class where it drops below 4. So it's 3.9 or so, which of course makes me very, very sad, but I have to say, I normally have a hard time then understanding that. What was so different in that seminar that all of a sudden the evaluation dropped? So I mean, I would wish to say, well, I can analyze it, then I can improve. I like to read the evaluations, and I think they're very, very useful. I'm always trying to preach that to my colleagues in Germany. There has been 10 years of debate in Germany whether they should evaluate. And most of my colleagues are wildly against it. I mean, I think they're very useful, but not in the sense that I could always necessarily explain why in one case they were very good, in other cases they were not. I mean, if you have one student, although they are anonymous, as everybody knows, who really trashes, you normally know why that happens. There was something, some unhappiness. But there was, for example, one course I was teaching last year, Introduction into Literary Studies for first-year graduate students, which I taught before, which I like to teach. And I thought everything has gone well, and that course was not so good in the evaluations, but I have no way of explaining it, so that's already a shortcoming. Third point why I think I'm not such a good teacher, and that's on my mind largely these days, I'm pretty bad, as some of you know, at correcting and returning papers. First of all, because I always have so many other things to do, so I grade them, but then I would like to write a long commentary. Maybe I'm too ambitious about this commentary. So this is for those who are still waiting for the commentary from the last course. I have my best intention to do it, to write it really over the weekend. I'm also very bad at something that is academic standard in a good sense in America, at telling people how to write. You know, and that may have to do partly because I'm not a native speaker, when I see teaching fellows do that a lot when I was doing an IHAM, so they really rewrite the entire paper, this is how the correct grammar goes, this is good style. I don't have such a certainty about what good style is, and I get easily carried away by the bad style of somebody. So sometimes my colleague would see it, how could you not correct the student's style? Well, you know, I think that's his way or her way of expressing herself or himself, and I'm maybe sloppy about that. Another thing where I think I'm not such a good teacher, and that is always bad in my evaluations, there's this one category, availability outside classroom, and that is horrible. I mean, I get horrible grades in this one. Although and because there's a paradox implied, I do think I offer quite a number of office hours. I do between 10 and 15 hours of regular office hours per week and more individual appointments. But there's this list on my door in Building 260, and it's gotten horrible in the last couple of quarters, really. That list is always signed up solidly for the whole quarter in the first week. And then, of course, I'm not terribly flexible, and that is bad. I mean, it is bad. I think this is where I think I'm a real tragic figure, right? That I'm doing so many office hours. But it's maybe the logic of capitalism, because everybody comes to my office hours, everybody wants to go there. And then I sometimes find out, finally the appointment comes after 2 months, and people don't really know what they want to talk about. But that is a problem. A fifth problem is that I'm well aware that I talk too much in class. Even in a class that's called a dialogue, a sophomore dialogue, about which I will call a little bit later, I always talk too much. That reminds me of an anecdote that is famous in Germany, and you may know the two protagonists of that anecdote. One protagonist is Hans-Georg Gadamer, the inventor, as some people say, of philosophical hermeneutics, who is now 102 years old and still alive and kicking, and his academic mentor, the great Edmund Husserl. So when Gadamer was a very young student, 18 years old, he went to Freiburg to study with Husserl, where everybody knew that Husserl was a horribly bad teacher who never would admit any conversation, any dialogue. So naive Hans-Georg Gadamer, 18 years old, it's hard to imagine today, Gadamer, 18 years old, goes into, takes the first session of Husserl's seminar, and after 10 minutes raises his arm and asks a question. And Husserl is very astonished, but makes one sentence of response and then goes on rambling for 4 hours. These were 4-hour philosophical seminars without interruption. And whoever knows Husserl's prose knows that's a lot, 4 hours of Husserl. And then at the end, says Gadamer, of that session, Husserl did something unusual. He'd only once in his career, he turned to the students and said, "Today in particular, I wanted to thank you for the very lively discussion." Right? So I sometimes have the feeling, if I think, oh, this has been very dialogic, I may be as bad as bad old Edmund Husserl, which is on one side arrogant to say. A sixth point where I think I'm not such a good teacher is that while I normally have fun when I'm teaching, and when people allow me to talk, maybe that's the reason, I'm not one of those, as you would say in German, Vollblutlehrer. I mean, I've never heard myself saying that I could not live without teaching. I mean, I'm not necessarily looking forward to thinking much about retirement, but I can well imagine a life without teaching, although I have fun in the classroom. But I will confess that I have even more fun writing. So, you know, there's this dichotomy. You either like to write or like to teach. I mean, I like them both, but I could imagine living without teaching, okay, to be honest. And then finally, and that completely disqualifies me for this lecture series, I really don't believe that you can learn all that much about teaching. Now that, Michelle and I are probably going to have a long conversation over lunch about that. I do think it is one of those things where talent is really of the essence. And, you know, I think some people are indeed, that's romantic to say, naturally good teachers, and others are not so much. And there's not so much you can do about it. I mean, you can certainly improve if you are pedagogically challenged. You know, I mean, talk a little bit less than I did when I was 28 years old today in a seminar, but nevertheless, I mean, so what can you really tell people about teaching? So I was asking myself, why am I being invited? Because, I mean, if it went by the Dean's Award for Distinguished Teaching, you would have 3 lectures per week, because everybody has gotten this award. So is there anything I have going for myself? And I will tell you the few things that came to mind that justify my invitation. I mean, one is that, and I'm really honored about that, I have been invited for the last couple of years to help the football department recruit football players. And I've been pretty successful in that. I have to tell you my most triumphant case, I learned this morning. So you always have the brunches organized where the families come and the players come, and you normally get 1 or 2 players you should convince to come to Stanford. Now this year I had the absolute assignment from hell. So here's how it goes. There's a guy who committed to Stanford last week. His name is Vincent. He's actually an All-American offensive lineman. So, I mean, very qualified for the humanities. I said, what do you read? And the first answer was, you know, this big lineman, high school senior, says, oh, you know, Professor, I regret there's one novel by Dostoevsky which I haven't read yet. That was quite something for an offensive lineman. But here is why it was a mission from hell. So they have these sheets they fill out. So top choice, school he wants to go, Notre Dame. So with Willingham having gone to Notre Dame, I said, why did he bother to come at all, right? And then Stanford wasn't even mentioned as top choices. Then second thing, so I talked to him and his father, find out they're Orthodox Catholics. And I thought, why doesn't he go to Notre Dame? But it gets worse. So I talked to the father, who's an MD. The father tells me he went to Notre Dame. He's an alumnus. I think that's the end of it. It gets worse. The father was 4 years a starter for the Notre Dame football team, right? And I was short of saying, why did you bother coming to Stanford? Now Vincent committed. I mean, so that's a teaching. I mean, it's not teaching quite, but that's certainly a triumph. The second thing is that my office hours are so oversubscribed, which is a problem for me, and I don't know really why, but I mean, that is maybe being popular in a strange way. I have heard through the grapevine that an IHAM Things of Beauty that I've been teaching twice with my colleague from musicology, Tobias Plebuch, got comparatively very good evaluations, so that's nice. And so does the only course I'm kind of repeating, but I will talk about that later, the sophomore dialogue about continental philosophy thinking in the present, which has, as any sophomore dialogue, 7 slots, and we get now increasing number of applications year after year. It's now by 70, so that's good. I mean, that's something I'm proud of. But then again, I have no recipe for these success stories, you know, also stories of non-success. So I thought before I really come to my main argument in praise of classroom teaching, so what would I do if ever a young colleague asked me for some hints about teaching? Because I have no teaching philosophy. And again, you know, I was scratching my head and I here come up with a couple of hints, and as a decimal fetishist, this is now point 2. My presentation, there's 7 hints again, so that's nicely symmetrical. 7 reasons why I'm not a good teacher, and 7 hints in that sense, very briefly practical hints, which I take seriously, some of them a little bit ironic. But so in the first point, the first hint would be I turn something that is a shortcoming, namely that I don't have a teaching principle and don't think honestly that I'm all that good a teacher, into a virtue or into a recommendation. I think it is maybe counterproductive to have a solid teaching philosophy. See, it's a little bit like I don't believe in mock interviews for graduate students. The reason being that I think every committee is different. You know, I mean, the committees I'm on, when we go to the MLA recruiting people, we haven't recruited many, unfortunately, in recent times for the humanities at Stanford. They're just different, you know, depending on the colleagues, depending on how the coffee was in the morning, depending on the candidate. So I think the first thing, rather than going into a seminar saying, that's my teaching philosophy, of course you have certain experience, but I think it is very, very important to pay attention to that specific group and how that works and how they look at you and how they interact and so forth. And I think if you have too much of a teaching philosophy, you don't do that. You're not flexible enough. So maybe, you know, I turn the disadvantage to the advantage. I think to have all too solid a teaching philosophy is not a good thing. A second principle is a kind of optimization point. I think one should never ever go into a class without really preparing it. I believe in spontaneity, you know, whatever that exactly means, but not so much in teaching. And I have to say, and that's a probably anal, compulsory, neurotic point, in the 31 years of my teaching, I've never gone into any class without preparing it, maybe because I would be so nervous. And maybe some of you who have been my students thought I was unprepared, but honestly, I'm not aware that I've ever gone into any class unprepared. But here's the optimization point. I do think there's a huge danger of over-preparing. The problem being, narcissistic as we all are, I may be hyperbolically, once you have prepared it, you want to dump that on your students, right? And I think there's a real danger, especially in a seminar format, that you jam that you have so much information that there's no space really, even if you then say, oh no, we have 5 minutes of discussion. So I mean, I think there's a very difficult fine line, depending on the individual class, between never going unpreparedly but not over-preparing it. Third thing, that's a very bad one. Basically, I'm not a great believer anymore, with one recent exception, in co-teaching, joint teaching, teaching with colleagues. But let me at least say it is a huge misunderstanding to think that co-teaching makes your life easier. So if 2 people teach a class, that's 50% of the investment. I mean, my experience is for the class to work, it is actually more. I mean, if you teach it with somebody, so that means it has to be really worthwhile for you and for the students, I mean, intellectually. Because you have to coordinate it well, you have to know what your colleague is going to talk about, and so forth. So this thing like the more instructors for one class, the less work, just doesn't work. I mean, and if somebody ever believed it, I think that is really dangerous. Fourth point is a critical point not about myself this time, but about colleagues. I mean, over and again, people come to this oversubscribed office hour telling me that Professor X or Y told them that he or she will not accept them as their advisees for writing an honors thesis and writing a dissertation. I mean, that is possible for 2 reasons, namely that there are limits quantitatively. You know, can only seriously have so and so many advisees. And of course, there are also limits of competence. I mean, the potential advisee may want to write on a field that you don't really feel comfortable with. But that there can be any other reason, I find absolutely scandalous. And I have to say that, and you all know that there is a reality. People act as, you know, I know a colleague in the lit department who recently said, and I will not specify whether it was he or she, will not take any more doctoral students in the next 5 years. I think that is completely impossible. I mean, that's what we are being paid for, you know. I think all the other things are hobby horses. I mean, writing and being a good intellectual and so on. That's what we're being paid for, and I think that's a serious point. So, I mean, this is not an advice. If I had any power, I would say no, unless you can prove that you have too many, or this is really not your field of expertise. There's an absolute obligation. I'm not even talking of ethics. I mean, should be a legal, much more formally imposed upon legal obligation by the university. Point 5, as well, that may be very personal. Sometimes you hear colleagues talking about their classes as if it was wine. So the older it gets, I mean, there's a limit, the better. And I can remember a colleague who told me, and they was teaching a certain course for the 25th time, and it's getting better and better. I absolutely don't believe in that. And the reason why I don't believe in that is that, as far as my experience goes, when I'm struggling with a topic, when I feel this is a topic that is challenging for me, maybe, you know, because I don't have all the information, or maybe it's not quite thought through, I think that's when I'm a good teacher. I mean, and this is an empirical thing. This is when I normally get good evaluations and when the class goes well. And I feel, I will give you an example, actually. You know that IHUMS, and that is well justified given the investment, mainly financial investment, should be taught at least 3 times. So when we did this IHUM Things of Beauty with Tobias for the first time, it was pretty successful, but there were lots of things to be improved, and we worked a lot in that. So when we're teaching it this fall, a second time, pretty much everything was changed, and there was a challenge. Now, we were very happy this time, and I wouldn't really know what to change. I mean, probably there's possibility to improve. I wouldn't know subjectively what to change, and this was one of the reasons why I decided I would not do it again, because I thought it would probably be disappointing. Now, you know, that's a wash, and it's maybe too easy. And in the sense of not making things too easy, I will finally make my 7th recommendation. That is what people in Spain, with the reference to the New Testament, would call the pedagogy of Herodes. You know, Herodes who killed all these children. Don't let yourself be convinced that spoon-feeding is the right thing, that you know, oh, these students are not so smart and they just come from high school. I would actually say, I mean, although it's problematic to talk about that numerically, if, for example, in an IHUM, there's a 5% margin where the students have a hard time understanding, that may not be bad pedagogically. because that keeps them trying hard, that keeps them wanting to go back to understand something that they have not previously understood. I actually think it is better to have that margin of 5% where they are struggling than to have the margin that it is not enough. So, and I'm not saying it should be 40%, no, that wouldn't work, but I think to really figure out in each individual class how far they can go, which, I mean, Trina knows that, she was a fellow in the IAM, was very, very different from the first IAM and second IAM. You know, it's each time 200 kids, but very, very different, and you could, in different topics, go, the level or the ceiling was different. I think that is important. Now, here's the crisis of my decimal principle. For some reason, I still have a point, although I thought it was only 7. And the last point leads now into my main argument, and that is the point, don't let yourself be convinced that each time that you substitute yourself, and by yourself I mean mainly your body, by a piece of technology, you have achieved something important. But first of all, that's a simple reason, everybody knows that, because technology, especially for a technological idiot like myself, makes you very, very vulnerable in classroom. I mean, my young colleague and fabulous colleague Tobias, with whom I was doing the IHAM, had this beautiful lecture prepared on Spanish painting in the age of Garcia Lorca. I was lecturing Garcia Lorca's poetry, and he had it all, you know, I couldn't even say on what kind of technological device, and it turns out that that very morning it didn't work in the lecturing hall. And Tobias had to basically, that had happened to him already with Don Giovanni, but as he's a musicologist, he kind of danced and sang his way himself to the Don Giovanni lecture, but with painting it's very difficult, you know. I mean, if it's Jackson Pollock, you may be some dripping and some action painting, but with Edward Hopper, it is really kind of, you could say, house, kind of railroad, but I mean, it didn't really work. A second reason why, and this is now leading into my argument, why I think one should not always substitute by technology. You know, I'm romantic enough to believe that it is a good thing to cultivate your rhetoric enough so that you might do the emphasizing that other people do with PowerPoint, you know. I mean, if you cannot master rhetorically what you do by PowerPoint, then you just don't qualify for this job, you know, sad as it may be. Now, this brings me now to my main argument, because except for this final skeptical remark, don't feel triumphant each time that you substitute yourself by a piece of technology, I haven't said much about what is my main topic today, real classroom presence. And by presence, I really mean not only presence in the metaphorical sense, I mean presence in the etymological sense of pre esse Latin. That means to be physically in front of something. So something becomes tangible for you. So this presence that we have, you know, I'm not going to hug everybody, but, but yeah, we could shake hands, for example, this type of classroom's presence. Now, why is this an issue, and why is it in tension with classroom technology? I mean, not a necessarily bad tension, but there is a tension. So this will be my lead into the main argument and decimal fetishist. My third point, and I will have to disappoint you regarding this question, I will simply quote or summarize a lecture that Gerhard Casper gave several years ago in Germany in an endowed lectureship by the Siemens Foundation. It's actually the Appliances Siemens Foundation, which is the main sponsor of things like that in Germany. And that lecture made a big splash in Germany, this having to do with the fact that Germany is at the point where the state feels they will, for the first time ever in German history, ask for tuition. And this was the context. Unfortunately, this talk, I don't even know whether it exists in English, didn't make such a big splash here in America, and you will see, I think the argument is terribly important. Gerhard started this lecture by admitting that in the unforeseeable future, the cost per student per year will rise faster, dramatically faster than inflation. And that means there will be put pressure, unbearable financial pressure, either on the state, in the German case, I mean no tuition, but the state has to invest. Average student in Germany per year costs 70,000 marks. Now that's now in euros, 36,000 euros. That's a serious amount of money. And you know at Stanford it's much more expensive than that. You all know that tuition is a small part. But nevertheless, it puts an unbearable financial strain on the university and on the families who have to come up with tuition. So here I will make my only technology-friendly argument. In this situation, says Gerhard, and I completely agree with him, we will have to substitute for financial reasons to keep the university floating as much as possible by the much cheaper instruction via electronic media. Yeah? I think basically all teaching that can be defined as pure transmission of knowledge, all teaching for whose description the concept of information is enough, will have to be replaced. You know, we may regret that, but I think there are good reasons, independently of whether this is a state university system or a private university system, will have to be replaced in the long run by software. I think that's unavoidable, also because of the knowledge explosion. But the question then remains, and that's going to be the key question for my lecture, which are those types, which are those functions of instruction, of teaching, that cannot be replaced, that require real classroom presence. Now, and immediately after formulating my main question, I'm already giving away what my main argument will be. Why I want to emphasize even more than Gerhard the intuition that real classroom presence should be maintained and is very, very important, I also want to admit, and this is the real dramatic point, that at this point, and astonishingly enough, we don't have any good obvious answers. Even we enthusiasts don't. I think many of you, I mean, all these lectures are self-selective. If you read the title, you maybe came because you agree with me that one should praise real presence in the classroom. But if I ask myself, and maybe if I ask yourself, what really is the reason, you can say, well, I have that feeling, but we don't have enough good, convincing reasons. So therefore, because those of us who are in favor of real presence in the classroom and defend face-to-face teaching, we don't have strong arguments. And I think this precisely is a situation where if we blindly push our self-substitution by technology, that will be suicidal. Not suicidal for us, the already full professors, who at a private university have a contract that says without limitation of time, meaning Stanford goes bankrupt. Of course, the contract does no longer exist. This was a main concern of my mother when Stanford hired me, and I was going from a state university system to a private university system. And I asked the then provost, what happens if Stanford goes bankrupt? And the then provost Ross, in his very typical way, some of you may remember him, said, well, then you are on the street, but it's not going to happen tomorrow. So that was my security to come to Stanford. But you see my point again. So A, I'm strongly in favor of real presence classroom situation. I'm convinced that there must be good reasons, but I do think, and that is what triggers my reflection, that we don't have very strong reasons, neither empirically nor philosophically, and that if we don't improve this situation, we are very, very vulnerable in the future. And in this situation, as long as we don't know where the line is, this line Gerhard is saying, something will be substituted in the future, I think this enthusiastic and sometimes naive and sometimes blind pushing, oh, the more technology, the better, and the more websites, the better teacher, and so forth, is very dangerous, is indeed suicidal. Now, in order to get going an argument, to at least come up with some arguments that are more than an intuition, more than this gutsy feeling that it's nice to sit together around a table, I would like to dedicate the fourth part, decimal fetishist, to the question, what is the core function of the university? And I will mainly focus on college there. And I'm, of course, speaking from a humanities point of view. I mean, that is my field, although there is reason to believe, even statistical reason to believe, that what has become core for what I'm talking about as the mission of the university in recent decades is actually a perspective from which the humanities and the classical sciences are very close. So if you look, for example, on development of enrollment statistics and so forth, I mean, even the best department in the world, like our theoretical physics department, is under the same stress as some humanities departments today. And I think this has to do with a dichotomy with which I will now begin my fourth part about the functions of college, and then coming back, so what is the function of college? Can you then say that this function has to do something immediately with real classroom presence? I mean, the dichotomy, the distinction I want to make is distinction between professional education and the X, the core function of college. I would say professional education, not only in the Anglo-American tradition, but more clearly in the Anglo-American tradition, professional education is not the main mission of college. I mean, I have nothing against it. I'm actually very proud of our fabulous professional schools at Stanford, but that is something different. So this then leads to the double question: A, what is the core mission, the core function of a college education? And, of course, given my topic, is this function related at all in a systematic way to real classroom presence? Or is there a way to justify real classroom presence through rethinking the core function? I'm not saying the only function, but the core function of college. And I'm very sorry that on top of my German accent, of which I'm very embarrassed, I thought that would go after 13 years, but it didn't. And after already having quoted somebody who has a heavier German accent than myself, namely Gerhard Kasper, at least a different one because this is Northern German, I will now refer again to two Germans, very old Germans, long dead and gone, namely Wilhelm von Humboldt, the founder of the University of Berlin, and the sociologist Max Weber, when I try to summarize their argument about the core mission of the university. Here again I agree with Gerhard, although this was a natural convergence. I don't have it from him that Humboldt and Max Weber are probably until today, and if you haven't read them on these topics, do read them, the most interesting people in terms of thinking about the core mission of the university. But, you know, with my new American passport and a greater sympathy and understanding of Anglo-American culture, I would like to add that I could as well quote on these issues Cardinal Newman. I mean, actually, it's almost funny how Newman had obviously not read Humboldt on these issues, but they're very, very close, sometimes even in the metaphors they're using. So trying to do an extreme summary here, you're not looking really bored, but I nevertheless want to do a strict summary and not go into any detail. Here are the three main theses of Wilhelm von Humboldt, Max Weber, and Newman. I mean, the points where they converge, there of course divergences too. The first one I want you to listen very closely is the most interesting one. They say the core mission of the university, I'm saying college also, the word college was not available to Wilhelm von Humboldt, is about a confrontation with open questions. So by definition, the questions that are in the core of the university are open questions. Humboldt even goes so far to say, and I full-heartedly agree with him, they should ideally be questions without a possible answer. There should be this kind, to say it in Latin, of perpetuum mobile questions, which keep you thinking about them indefinitely. And once you reach a question, says Humboldt, and I'm quoting him here, you eliminate them, they're no longer apt for the university, he says. Then second, and this is more Humboldt than anybody else, I mean, surprising for a Prussian Secretary of State, Humboldt says, the situation in which the scenario, he says, within which these open, systematically open questions should be tackled, should not be the hierarchical situation of instruction. This is why I'm always hesitant to use instruction for teaching. He says, and that's a beautiful quote, and there is a quote now here, the situation in which you tackle these open questions is the community of teachers and students in their mutually energizing enthusiasm about the question. Isn't that beautiful? Their mutually energizing enthusiasm about the question. Those among you who know Humboldt know that the word energeia, energizing, has a whole philosophical meaning for him. But I mean, you understand it correctly in the everyday meaning. And the third principle in which the three authorities converge is to say, these questions and the way you proceed these questions, you lead these questions, have to emerge immanently out of the community of teachers and students. They can never be prescribed, says Humboldt, being the Secretary of State, by the government, hands off, says Humboldt to himself, nor by the sponsors, nor by, you know, the dean and so forth. I think this is very, very important. Now, you've got these three principles. I don't think I have to recap them, which I would now do in a seminar. I don't. And I give you my interpretation of Humboldt, Weber, and Cardinal Newman to get more to a present-day language. The way I understand them is, and this is my keyword, some of you know that the task, the core task of college is intellectual complexification. Intellectual complexification. That means precisely, and you have understood me correctly, we are not about finding or transmitting solutions. We are not about recipes. We are not about making intellectual life easy. No, we are about making intellectual life difficult. And why can one say that? I mean, isn't that confusing for students? Well, I think because confrontation with complexity, and I will develop this concept a little bit, confrontation and complexity is what expands your mind. It is something like, and I like this metaphor because it has a very venerable Greek background, like intellectual gymnastics. And this is what makes you a viable member of the society and so forth in your life. So I will not tell the students, although I've never voted a party that would not correspond to the Democratic Party here in the election, vote Democrats. And I hate this frame for license plate which says, if you are a good friend, tell your friends to not vote Republicans. See, I think I have to get them into a position where they make their own decision. And that's what I'm doing by confronting them with intellectual complexity, by leading them, as Weber says, to the door of intellectual complexification. But I think we are not, it's irresponsible almost, to give them solutions, to give them recipes. Now, in my own terminology, I like to use a metaphor, maybe it's not even a metaphor, for this confrontation with intellectual complexity, and I call that riskful thinking. Now, what do I mean by riskful thinking? I mean that in our everyday life, in our everyday practice outside the university, of course we need recipes. Of course we need solutions. Yeah? So it is bad in our everyday life, think of surgery, right? I mean, you don't want a surgeon who experiments on you while he's performing surgery. So they need recipes. But the university, that would be my second point here about riskful thinking. The university is the place institutionally that is about complexification, about things, making things more complex, more difficult. In the everyday you have to decomplexify, and this is why I think that this metaphor, which is normally used in a negative way for the university, ivory tower, is a good thing. So I could also have said in praise of the ivory tower. I do not think it would be a good thing that all of our complexifications permeated everyday life. So university is not mainly about exportation of solutions. I think this isolation, which is so visible in the relationship between Stanford and Palo Alto, is a good one. And this is, in a way, when we maximize our function. I give you my favorite narrative about riskful thinking, which some of you have heard, but I think for me the narrative is so good that I like to convey it over and again. And this is about a philosopher with whom I have a complex relationship. I like and dislike him, Jacques Derrida. And this is a story shortly before I came here. Derrida had his first visiting professorship at a German university, happened to be my university in Germany. And this was a moment when Derrida was even more enthusiastic about Heidegger than he has normally been throughout his career. And there was a big Heidegger discussion in Germany, and Derrida, who had an Orthodox Jewish upbringing, was, raving about Heidegger. And all of a sudden a student interrupts him and says, Professor Derrida, don't you think it is problematic to be so enthusiastic about Heidegger, given the Nazi past of Heidegger, which is undeniable? And Derrida gave this chilling answer, but which I think is a fabulous example for riskful thinking and for why it is good to be a little bit isolated. He says, look, there's no doubt and there's no debate about Heidegger having been a Nazi. The worthwhile question is, could he have been, and this is Derrida's judgment, the greatest philosopher of the 20th century without his proximity to Nazi ideology? Now, my answer would be immediately no. I don't want that. But I do think even this question has to be possible at a university. It has to be possible at a university, whereas I think it should not be debated at a high school. It should not be debated, that type of a question, in everyday context. But at a university, I think even this question has to be possible. So I'm not saying this was a great question about Heidegger, but I think the case is interesting, and I think it is interesting that somebody with a Jewish upbringing and no political sympathies for the Heidegger and likes was asking this question. Now, how can one achieve pedagogically this riskful thinking, this confrontation with complexity? The answer is obvious, but let me just spell it out. I think in the first place, and I think that is something one should think about each time that one is teaching, I think our task in the classroom is really to be a catalyst of complexity. So it is our task to make things more complex, to not sometimes you have certain recipes, but when people talk about methodology and literary criticism, and I take the word method seriously, it normally makes me nervous. You have this kind of autopilot interpretation. If I see that, even if I find it interesting, I try to make it more complex. Then second, and that is the more pedagogical part literally, I think we have to make sure that although we try to be catalysts of complexity, that students really take that up, you know, and confront themselves with that complexity. And there's a danger that even if you present something complex, students take shortcuts. And the main thing, and here I'm using a metaphor by Max Weber that I've already obliquely mentioned, the main thing is we should not guide them too much in this process. So I think we should guide them, and this is Weber's metaphor, towards the gates of complexity, of this complexification, but not, and this is Weber's metaphor, not guide them through that door. I mean, that can be painful. I mean, I once wrote in an article, and to my great pleasure, Gerhard Kasper liked that quote, that if we are honest, you know, it's this obligation that humanity has. So reading is the most wonderful thing. I mean, I have to say what I find so fascinating about reading and why I'm hooked is that it's always an oscillation between pleasurable and painful. And I think, you know, if you want a student to get the experience of Ulysses, for example, he or she has to fear that there's a painful moment in reading Ulysses, when it's too much, when it's overwhelming, when you cannot follow Molly Bloom's dialogue because, you know, then there's no full stop, and so forth and so forth. But you get my point. I think it is important to lead towards that complexity, to make sure that this confrontation takes place, but not to lead through the door of complexity. This brings me to my point 5, which is a point to relax, and then I come to the final stretch. You know, these are high-flying principles, right? You quote Wilhelm von Humboldt and so forth. Of course, I should ask myself, do I ever teach a class where this works more or less in the way I'm theoretically claiming here? And I will give you 2 or 3 examples where I have the impression it worked well. One of them is indeed this IHAM Things of Beauty that I was teaching with Tobias Plebuch, which I can't emphasize enough because that was a very, very positive experience of co-teaching, likewise for the teaching fellows we had. Now, our idea, the basic idea was to give aesthetic experience a chance. So as all IHAMs, we had 5 items: opera, architecture, poetry, athletic beauty, sports, that was our challenge, and painting. So aesthetic experience in different media. 2 negative principles. A, we would not attach aesthetic experience to any ethical principle, so that you could make judgment, that's good art, that's bad art. That is possible. I mean, I have my doubts, but we didn't do that intentionally. And then second and more importantly, we went out of our way telling the students, try to see how you react to Don Giovanni, or you react to Lorca's poetry, or to Hopper and Jackson Pollock. There is no obligation that you like all of them, nor an obligation that you like any of them, but just give, that's why I was saying, give aesthetic experience a chance. So in the third of our 4 lectures, 5 items, 20 lectures, we would always try really, and that was our metaphor, to lead them towards aesthetic experience. So I would tell them, for example, why there is one poem of Garcia Lorca, which is actually a poem of homosexual love, which I have a hard time having empathy with, being heterosexual. But I told them, look, I mean, for reasons I ignore, that described in my feelings, this is a poem that is terribly important for me. But I could not tell them why it should be important for them. I mean, that's how far you can go. So I think that worked well. I think I will just give you one other example, and I will skip the graduate seminar because that was very good but more complicated. And this is this sophomore dialogue thinking. In the present, you know, sophomore dialogues have a maximum enrollment of 7. As I'm a little bit incontinent, I always take 8, 9, or 10, which is not quite legitimate, but I'm doing it. Now, what we do, we read there 5 contemporary philosophical texts from continental philosophy, and it's never the same course because, except with one text, I always change them. I do give the students an introduction into this text. Actually, it's an extroduction before, in the session before we discuss them. I dedicate the last 20 minutes to give them some context, but ideally, and sometimes it works, I think a couple of times that Mark was taken, it works, I hardly have to intervene. I mean, I have to intervene if I think they're not focused towards complexity, but I let them discuss, right, and I'm kind of monitoring the discussion. That would be an ideal for me. Also, I have not write them term papers in that thing. I have them writing philosophical journals. So the obligation is to write every week at least 5 pages on how you very individually react to these texts, emphasizing your difficulties. I mean, given the thumb rule, the best thing is to start with those passages that you do not understand, trying to understand why you don't understand them, by which time you normally begin to understand them. Okay, so that brings me to my sixth and final point, and you have been a very friendly audience because it's been longer than 35, 40 minutes. There's, of course, a temptation now that I talk about my own seminars that I become too self-congratulatory. So I want to come back to this open question. I mean, at this point, I think and I hope I have made some suggestion about how real presence classroom teaching and the core mission of college, confrontation with complexity, belong together, but I have not made any explicit proposals, and that has a reason in a way, because my main emphasis is to say that it's an open problem. See, I don't have the real answers for that. I share with hopefully many of you, because some people are nodding, the intuition that there's an importance to it, but I think my main point is we need to know more about that very urgently. I think it is a survival question for that type of university in which many of us seem to believe. It may be also that there are empirical studies, comparative studies about relative teaching success via electronic media and in classroom, but if they exist, I think we need more of them. Now here's then my final question. Could this confrontation of complexity not happen via email? So that everybody reads a text, we are connected by email, and the students get back to you, and I get back to them, and I can even monitor their discussion. Now, it could happen. I think there's no reason to assume it could not happen, but paradoxically, I think it would get much more expensive in this very case if we did it by email. See, because it takes me much more time, I mean, time that a university would have to pay for, to I mean, if I have to write by email what I'm saying in one seminar session, even if I'm not going the Husserl route, that would be many more hours and would be much more expensive, because then I would feel, you know, oh, I give it in writing and I have to check it and so forth, than in classroom teaching. So I would say, under conditions of confrontation with complexity, in classroom teaching may be the only modality where in classroom teaching, real presence teaching, is actually cheaper than doing it by electronic media. That's an exception. I don't think the same rule applies for transmission of knowledge, but in this case it is cheaper. But for those who have been patiently and politely waiting until this point, let me give the two hypothetical answers that go beyond this surprising economic argument about what I think is specific in classroom teaching. But again, emphasis again, I will say it one final time, we don't really know. My first hypothesis, and now after this Derrida episode I'm kind of embarrassed to quote Heidegger, has to do with the way Heidegger describes thinking. He tries to de-emphasize thinking as something we as subjects perform. He says thinking is having the composure of letting thought fall into place, which is very strange. I mean, this composure to let something happen. Now, if you look, most of you will know that, at transcripts of discussions people thought were very good. We had a very, very good colloquium Heidegger in this room a year ago, Bay Area Heidegger, and I thought these were about the best academic discussions I've ever participated in. But I know if we had a transcript, and I'm very skeptical about that, we would be very, very disappointed, because normally, you know, you achieve a higher complexity and higher precision in writing than in talk in the discussion. But what characterizes those transcripts of oral discussions is that all of a sudden, although you have to read 5 and 10 pages and disappointed, all of a sudden you think there's a breakthrough. There's a qualitative change. And you don't know quite how it happens. You couldn't explain how it was leading to that, but I do think, and this is something that one would have to explain both philosophically and maybe even empirically know, I do think that discussions in physical presence, in real presence, have this capacity of being the catalyst situation for such intellectual breakthroughs. Yeah, so this is an intuition to explain an intuition, but I do think there's a strength. And it's precisely, for me, this is when I'm referring to transcripts. It is not as, oh, you see the strategy of somebody, how he went towards that. No, I think precisely the possibility for in-classroom teaching of letting something happen, which cannot happen if you teach by transmission of information, is a strength of in-classroom teaching. The second and final argument that I have has to do with presence in the etymological sense, with real presence, with your body. It will sound a little bit like this famous and especially in our country problematic argument about erotics of the classroom. I'll talk about that because I don't want to go into harassment zones. No, it has to do with an argument in which whether you find the presence of the other person's body pleasant or unpleasant is relatively neutralized. It works with good feelings and bad feelings about the other person's physical presence. What I want to say that if you are in physical presence of other persons, that normally we don't talk about it normally, but this triggers relatively strong negative or positive feelings underlying the intellectual discussion going on in the classroom. I know this is problematic territory, but I think both the positive and the negative feelings can set free additional energy. I mean, I think there's nothing wrong, at least among students, let's include the instructors, if somebody thinks, wow, this other student looks really good and I really want to impress. I think that's quite okay. That's quite okay. The opposite can be the case. I really don't like that guy or that girl, or I really don't like that instructor. So it sets free a certain aggression, which I think can energize the discussion and which at least makes the discussion more complex. I know this is problematic territory, so I'm not saying that the physical presence makes you intellectually better, but it produces, and you know it could go endless Freudian arguments here, it produces a certain energy which is good for intellectual production, for production of complexity, and which I simply don't see in scholarly correspondence, for example, which I enjoy a great deal. I mean, Lazar Fleischmann, whom I owe this beautiful, beautiful invitation to Riga, can talk about that. I mean, this was a packed classroom in Riga where I was teaching. I've never seen those people, but there was something about the physical presence. But unfortunately, I saw yesterday the TV feature of the Latvian TV, what I looked like. I thought the students became so energetic because they must have hated me. See, I'm normally hiding my belly, but in Riga, for some reason, I was walking around a lot. So you see me struggling with explaining the intuition. There's the intuition that there is something to real classroom teaching. But one final time, and this is my final words, I want to say that this point about struggling is important, more important than approximations towards a solution. Why is real classroom teaching important? Seems to be the point for me that we have to push this issue. We have to find out what can be substituted without any problem, what can be replaced, and what cannot be replaced. And we have to find out more about how real presence in the classroom is systematically related to what we consider the core mission of the university. And my very pessimistic last sentence is that if we fail to do that, it will be suicidal for the university that I like, and it will be really suicidal for a university in which it is more or less justified to pay the tuition that we are asking families to come up with. I thank you for your attention. Oh, sure, yeah.
We really probably can just take one or two.
So we're in the CS department, we're building a video conference system designed specifically for sort of dialogue space. One or 2,000 students, really, everybody can see each other, everybody can hear each other. Do you think with technology like that will make the debate whether face-to-face and electronic media so
Well, let me give you an example. This is from engineering where I think there's no problem at all, and then I'll come to your question specifically. 2 years ago I was teaching at Stanford at Kyoto, and for some very weird reason, but made it actually very interesting for me, all the Stanford students, undergraduates who go to Kyoto are engineering majors. I mean, why this is the case has something to do with how the US saw Japan in the 90s, in the early 90s. But anyway, so being engineering students, they have tough teaching programs and stuff. So there were certain lectures where there was not even by video conference, but where the Stanford Kyoto Center has tapes, of some of our instructors. I always had the voice of my friend John Bravman in my ear because I was close to the student's office, my office, so they would always have somebody would have a John Bravman tape. Now this is about material science, I think that's the word, an introduction. I mean, as far as John tells me, as far as I could get from what I overheard, that is perfectly okay to do it this way. I mean, it's nice to see John there, but this would be a clear case for this transmission of information, where I think not only under Kyoto conditions, there would be probably politically good move in the future to replace that. Now, for me, the argument, 2,000 students and so forth, if this is a really important class, a class that invites for discussion and triggers discussion, I mean, my first thing, it shouldn't be 2,000 students.
Well, maybe it was like 2,000 people.
Oh, 2,000, sorry.
Yeah,
Sorry, no, that's my fault.
really for a small discussion. Like
Yeah, but I mean, then why would you do it by video conference? I mean, if it's 24 people, I mean, see, I mean, this is the point where I have no strong argument. So is there more about being in a room than seeing each other? I think it's already better to see each other than to do it by email and so forth. But I don't really see, I mean, see, sometimes, and that may be the case here, but I'm arguing hypothetically, and that's what I call suicidal. There's a drive, and that seems to be Stanford specific, and let me assure you, I love this place. But, to substitute ourselves by technology wherever we can, I mean, I would not be surprised if someday the big innovation announced in Stanford report, I mean, not by John, but by somebody, would be that now the sophomore dialogue goes by video conference. I mean, 7 students, right? I mean, I don't see necessity. That's a waste of money in the first place if it's 24 students. And my intuition would still be it is even better to be in real presence.
I think the argument is there's actually, in order to make education democratize, there's people who couldn't be here, and we're giving them opportunities to, let's say, work a part-time job and also pursue, able to take a class, for example. Just
Oh, so how would that go financially then? And to just let them, you open it up for...
yeah, but it's sort of like the Stanford Online for engineering, like they still pay the Stanford tuition, however, like $1,000 they pay, but they physically have to be somewhere else.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so here's my answer, and that's a problematic answer, but it precisely makes my final point. I agree with you, or not, I don't even know whether we agree. I have no strong argument to say that they should be really here, but my intuition and the intuition for whose argumentation I would like to know more is that we shouldn't do that. I should think they should be here. I will not start rambling about community, and I believe in that, but if you want to have a Stanford education, why the
Can just take 1 or 2.
So we're in the CS department, we're building a video conference system designed specifically for sort of dialogue system. When we're 2,000 students, everybody can see each other, everybody can hear each other. Do you think with technology like that will make the debate for the face-to-face and electronic media so right?
Well, let me give you an example. This is from engineering, where I think there's no problem at all, and then I'll come to your question specifically. 2 years ago, I was teaching at Stanford at Kyoto, and for some very weird reason, but made it actually very interesting for me, all the Stanford students, undergraduates who go to Kyoto are engineering majors. I mean, why this is the case has something to do with how the US saw Japan in the 90s, in the early 90s. But anyway, so being engineering students, they have tough teaching programs and stuff. So there were certain lectures where there was not even by video conference, but where the Stanford Kyoto Center has tapes, of some of our instructors. I always had the voice of my friend John Bravman in my ear because I was close to the student's office, my office, so they would always have somebody would have a John Bravman tape. Now this is about material science, I think that's the word, an introduction. I mean, as far as John tells me, and as far as I could get from what I overheard, that is perfectly okay to do it this way. I mean, it's nice to see John there, but this would be a clear case for this transmission of information, where I think not only under Kyoto conditions, there would be probably politically good move in the future to replace that. Now, for me, the argument, 2,000 students and so forth, if this is a really important class, a class that invites for discussion and triggers discussion, I mean, my first thing, it shouldn't be 2,000 students.
Well, maybe it was
Oh, 24, sorry.
Okay, I apologize.
Sorry, no. That's my fault.
Really for a small discussion. Like
Yeah, but I mean, then why would you do it by video conference? I mean, if it's 24 people, I mean, see, I mean, this is the point where I have no strong argument. So is there more about being in a room than seeing each other? I think it's already better to see each other than to do it by email and so forth. But I don't really see, I mean, see, sometimes, and that may be the case here, but I'm arguing hypothetically, and that's what I call suicidal. There's a drive, and that seems to be Stanford specific, and let me assure you, I love this place. But, you know, to substitute ourselves by technology wherever we can, you know. I mean, I would not be surprised if someday the big innovation announced in Stanford report, I mean, not by John, but by somebody, would be that now the sophomore dialogue goes by video conference. I mean, 7 students, right? I mean, I don't see necessity. That's a waste of money in the first place if it's 24 students. And my intuition would still be it is even better to be in real presence.
I think the argument there's actually, in order to make education democratized, there's people who couldn't be here. Now you're giving them opportunities to, let's say, work a part-time job and also pursue, able to take your class, for example.
Oh, so how would that go financially then? And to just let them, you open it up for?
Yeah, sort of like the Stanford Online for age random. Like they still pay the Stanford tuition, however, like $1,000 they pay. But they physically have to be somewhere else.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so here's my answer, and that's a problematic answer, but it precisely makes my final point. I agree with you, or not, I don't even know whether we agree. I have no strong argument to say that they should be really here, but my intuition and the intuition for whose argumentation I would like to know more is that we shouldn't do that. I should think they should be here. You know, I will not start rambling about community, and I believe in that, but you know, if you want to have a Stanford education, why the heck can you not be here? Yeah, I mean, you know, I think space does matter, and you know, there's also something about, especially in this campus where everything is on one campus, about community life. You know, being the sports fan that I am, not saying that everybody has to be in the Sixth Man's Club or something like that. Go Stanford, but I don't think so. This is, I mean, what's the American term? Université à distance. You know, that's the beginning of it, and that is clearly not the same. When once you so while you put me on the spot and confirm my own point that I don't have strong enough arguments, I'm not in favor of that. But my main point would be that oftentimes I observe that people just do it out of enthusiasm for gadgets, right? I mean, I was teaching actually a sophomore seminar with a colleague of mine whom I adore and with whom I really like to teach on philosophy and technology, history of technology. And you know, this guy was so prolific in websites that I sometimes thought that by the time students come to the classroom, there's no pressure. I mean, no intellectual pressure, you know, because everybody had already had their conversations on the website. And then you meet, and then this eventness doesn't happen. Okay. Yeah?
I'm wondering if we're not moving towards a different positive evaluation of a different set of skills among people, humanity, in a global sense. For example, I'm looking back 30 years ago, there were all sorts of arguments about children being in daycare centers while their mothers went to work. And a lot of studies that measured various outcomes, you know, child development variables as to whether the kids were going to fail to thrive if the moms went to work and put them in daycare centers. Well, you know, after a couple of years of such studies, the verdict was, you know, rendered for women. We can go to work and abandon the kids in the daycare, and everything's going to be fine, and they need exposure to all these germs and so on. And I'm wondering if we're not, you know, looking at this insidious technology that intrudes into, that interferes with the positive identification, the cathexis with the instructor. I'm wondering if we're just not part of a big technological and value shift in the next 20 years. In other words, this whole process is going to engender a different set of skills and a different valuation of those skills in 20 years.
No, I think that's absolutely a larger context. Let me give you one example. I think the problem is a positive reinforcement problem in the sense that I think the effects of an exaggerated enthusiasm for technology go in the same direction as certain social movements go, and so the double effect is bad. The following example is the following. So my wife is a high school teacher who actually, when I came at Stanford, she had been offered, and I don't think it was much because I pushed it, a job to teach French and Spanish in the French department, Spanish department. So that time we had my son from my first marriage, and we just had a baby and wanted to have another one. The night before we went here, I said, isn't that great? They offered you a job and stuff. And she said, have you ever asked me whether I wanted this job? I said, no. I was kind of embarrassed. So, I mean, she has not been in her profession for 13 years. And I swear by God, you know, in 1 out of 2 conversations with colleagues, that immediately makes me having a hard time. So that I think I'm this despot and I don't let her work. And so what I'm saying is there has been de-emphasizing, so you don't have to be at home. That has been an anti-choice thing, and I'm deliberately saying choice here, because I don't think it was my repressive attitude. It was just that was the life form she chose. And you know, whether we can financially swing that or not, that's anyway our problem. So she chose that. So, and I think now, and that would be my argument of the larger context, and that's a very interesting discussion, that the replacement of bodies by technology goes in the same direction. And I think it can produce an égalité, I'm saying that in the sense of the French Revolution, of life forms that none of us will really want. See, I think it's a much more interesting society where some moms decide to stay home and others work, and where both things are possible. But I think there, you know, being this technology renegade, it's not by choice. I'm just not talented for that, but for any gadgets. I got a lot of pressure, you know, real moral pressure. I remember, you know, for a long time I was not in email. My God. And then I asked the then dean and now provost Etchemendy, and there was an ironic question. Is it mandatory that I be on email? And he said, very unironically, being the analytic philosopher that he is, yes, it is mandatory. So now I'm generally available. Now, whether that makes my life better, whether that makes me better, I'm not saying it makes me worse in the Stanford, but it's not so clear, you know, because, see, I spend now 2.5 hours per day, and people here can confirm that, just making it through my email. I don't see any advantage for my work. But it is 2.5 hours that I'm certainly not available for anybody, you know? And it's random. I mean, you have to be, even before you have to trash them, you do open them, right? Unless there's a virus warning. I wish they all had virus. I mean, and so forth. So again, I have no strong arguments, not that the strong arguments that I want, but a little bit the passion of my discourse, and I hope you felt some passion, is to not go just in one monolithic direction, in that sense.
And we will have to close it